Constructive Criticism is sponsored by Oasis Games. MTGOasis.com is the place to get cards for your next Magic event. Try them out with code CCMTG for 15% off of your first order, and use the code WouldThatBeGood for 4% off of every order. Want to support the show directly? Head on over to patreon.com/CCMTG to check out some awesome benefits and future goals for the show. Thanks for listening, and here's this week's episode of Constructed Criticism. Hello everyone and welcome to the Constructed Criticism Network. This network is here to help you improve at Magic the Gathering at every level. From Pauper Leagues to Top 1000 Mythic, we've got you covered. If you want to hear the entire network, head on over to our sponsor at PureMTGO.com, where you can hear each and every show, each and every week, and check out their sponsor, MTGO Traders, and tell them that the CCMTG Network sent you. Now sit back, enjoy the show. From YouTube, podcasts, and more, here's this week's episode from ConstructedCriticism.com.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 396th episode of Constructed Criticism. I'm joined by my always here co-host, Abe. Abe, how you doing?
I'm doing great.
I love to hear that. Abe, we have a special guest this week. Spencer's gone. He's doing family stuff or whatever, and so we had to pull in a heavy hitter, you know? Spencer left. We didn't have anybody. It was awkward. It's just us two. We need to have that third person, the musketeer dynamic, if you would. So, Abe, who did we get today?
We have none other than one of the most accomplished Pioneer players in the world, Cain Rianhard. Most notably, very likely the reason why Walking Ballista's on the ban list.
That's what I was going to say. The reason Ballista's gone.
Yeah, someone who really knows their way around this format and, just won the Mana Trader series just a couple weeks ago for the Pioneer format. What better time than now to bring on someone who we constantly talk about on the show and how much we look to them as someone whose work we can trust when we are trying to do our own research and have them come on and talk about a format that they know the most about.
Hi, everyone. I'm Cain. I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, it's exciting. It's happy to have you on the show. Like Abe said, you come up a bunch, whether it's in stories from events or whatever, in tournament experiences to decks. It's a name that, listeners have heard a couple times. Now they get to put a voice to the name and everything and get to see some of the magic up close and personal. So are you excited to talk about Pioneer today? Because this is the first time, Cain, we've talked about Pioneer on the show in a serious context, in depth. And I would say over a year. It's been a long time.
That is exciting, man. Pioneer is probably my favorite format. I think it's just pretty much always the healthiest format. There are a lot of reasons for that might be controversial to some people.
I'm curious, why is it your favorite format? I think that it is pretty interesting. I think personally my favorite format right now is Modern. But what about Pioneer really has you itching to play it?
Part of it is that Pioneer is a little bit underexplored in a lot of ways. If you put in some extra work, there's always reward for that. But also doesn't blend together with the other non-rotating formats since you don't get the Modern Horizon supplemental product thrown in. While its unique identity has not always been the same over time, Pioneer always does have a distinct identity compared to the other formats, where with Modern and Legacy, Ragavan was defining both for a long time until very recently.
Yeah, now it's only defining one. How lucky.
Even across the arena formats, we've seen a lot of the Modern Horizons 2 cards kind of become a big fixture of those as well. So Pioneer is really unique in that way, I agree, where you get to play a format that kind of feels like something that is very separate and very different from anything else that most people spend time playing.
We do need to do our always improving segment first, though, Cain. So, Abe, you want to start things off for us. How did you always improve this week?
This week, I actually spent a bunch of time playing Legends of Runeterra with my older brother, and he's actually someone who got me into Magic. He's the first person who ever taught me how to play Magic when I was a kid. And since then, I've obviously played a lot more than he has, more into card games than he has become over the years, but this game has kind of been a way for us to connect, and he was struggling to figure out what the timeline is for what he should be expecting to get better at the game as a whole is, and really just having this conversation about good expectations were, what my process was, and reflecting on how long did it take me to be someone who intuitively understood what was going on in a board state and good attacks and good blocks and who's ahead in the big sense when it came to these games of limited we were playing. Not only did it have me breaking down the ideas that I had internalized like that, where I hadn't even thought about what it was that was setting me apart or making me come to these right decisions when we were playing games together faster than he was or in ways that he wasn't thinking about them. That was really reinforcing to me of all of the things that I do know and how to talk about them better. But I think also being able to share that with him and him kind of explaining it back to me in a way that he's understanding it really grew my perspective on the kinds of things that goes into the decision-making process is. Like the way that he was thinking about certain sets of like, well, do they have the combat trick and what are the things that happen if they do or don't? What matters in that situation, are ways that I hadn't ever really consciously thought about it because of the other heuristics I have in place. Having a really good opportunity to not only like see how far I've come and reflect on it, but to, hear someone else who I obviously communicate very well with, family, be able to share their insight and see it the way that they were seeing it as well was really eye-opening. Just some fundamental baseline things about card games in general, like the things that are really basic and limited. It was a really, really nice way to kind of feel the level ups I've had over the years and to even get more as I reconsider some of these very foundational questions of things that we do from someone else's perspective.
My always improving moment kind of comes from really working on this Tubert. Some of it actually, you're a character in the story, Abe. If you don't know, a Tubert is a two-person cube. It can be drafted with 4 people, but it's designed ideally to be played with 2 people. I really love Tuberts for a lot of reasons, and one of them is that, you actually get a cube-type gameplay and experience without having to find 8 people. And it's very easy, I found, to get one person to win a cube with you. It's pulling in the rest of them. It's pretty hard. So I love Tuberts, and I love working on them. I really like the idea of magic design and stuff like that, and getting to work on these like sort of mini sets and these mini environments with the way Tubert is really cool. And one of the things I love about Tubert is it's 180 cards. There's no other number a Tubert should be. It should be 180 always. And because of that, it kind of gives you these restrictions and stuff. And I've been trying to work on them. And I've done a couple different Tuberts, and I've built 2 of them in person now. Or I guess 3 now that this one's done. They're really cool, but typically I've been treating a lot of them very much bread and buttery, kind of supercharged core sets, I had goals and things I wanted to do with the Tuberts, but a lot of those things were like, let's make sure we're playing the battlefield, we're playing good ABC Magic. When people are playing this, they're having a good experience. It may not be like the most exciting, jaw-dropping cube type experience they've had, but they had a good time playing the limited match, And that was kind of like a lot of the goals for them in the past. But with this one, I really wanted to try and do some weirder stuff. So I built like a Grixis Tubert, and with the Grixis Tubert, I wanted to do things like make sure there was various different combos that you can pull off that are like game breaking, like you win the game in big flashy ways that I think a lot of players think about Cube, they think about things like Kiki Jiki, Splinter Twin, those type of cards. And so that's something that's really evocative, that my Tuberts in the past, when I tell people it's like a 2-player cube, they don't really have that experience. That's not something they're really getting. And I try to, tamper their expectations when I talk to them and tell them like, hey, like this is the control Tubert. It's all about just playing control games. Or like, hey, this is like a core set Tubert, but it's supercharged. So it's like, you're going to see some pretty powerful cards in there. And I wanted to do some of those and some other archetypal stuff. And it's really a little bit out of my warehouse and comfort zone. I showed it to you and you gave me some feedback. And the always improving moment comes from with this is really kind of taking a risk and a trust that people are going to get it and people are going to understand that there's a fail rate to their decks or whatever. They might not always have a great time. And for me, a lot of times I want to curate and make sure the environment is hospitable, especially to players who are maybe newer and don't get that. I want them to make sure they have a good time. You'll see this on the episodes of the podcast. We want to make sure that before we get into the deep end of a topic, that we kind of walk our way through the pool, so to be, and we wade into the deeper water slowly so that way no one gets lost along the way, which is something that Abe and I have talked about a lot, where sometimes I don't even want to go as deep as we could on the episodes because I'm afraid about losing listeners along the way and having them get lost. And I love a good cannonball in 9-foot water. It's just... Yeah, Abe doesn't even know there's a kiddie pool. Like, Abe doesn't know there are steps to get in the thing. He only cannonballs in on the 9-foot. And so Abe and I come at this from opposite ends. It was kind of accepting some of these things and taking some of the feedback. Actually, there was supposed to be a counterspell in the version I sent you, but I added 2 more to it. I just couldn't remember a Stoic Rebuttal. Like, I just legitimately couldn't remember that card's name, so I don't know if you noticed it was, like, missing a couple of cards. And I was in my head, I was like, Metalcraft Counterspell will get added whenever I figure its name out. I added some of that stuff because it's like, okay, you don't get to always do your thing here, but that's fine. We're kind of enabling some stronger stuff, and I put some other stuff, and I think there are ways in this Tubert to like put things like Battle Ball and Platinum Empyrean onto the board as early as turn 2. So I'm excited to play with it. I'm excited to see how that goes, but kind of taking the big step and reach of like, hey, sometimes things aren't going to be that way, and that's okay, and trying to expand my range and grow as a person to deal with those anxieties, and also be like, okay, maybe I've overreacted in the past, or maybe I was more right than I thought, but there is some room where I can, start maybe a little deeper or whatever. And that was my always improving moment this week.
And I'm glad I was able to give you some help. As I've been working on, my own cube design for a few months now that I talked about on the show a while ago, I think a lot about the kind of philosophies inherent in it and like what, especially when it comes to Two-Birds, you're kind of making almost like a two-person Magic board game. You're building a draft environment where it's like, oh, I'm going to replay this draft experience with someone else. But then how much of that do you want people to be able to feel like, oh, maybe this is possible and I'll have to do it next time, or, this is something I should chase after and maybe it did work or didn't work. How much do you want them to want to replay it because there's more potential there to do better? And how much do you want people to just be roped in by it in the first place? And it's kind of a trade-off. I think definitely not even struggling, but just grappling with that. Those kinds of trade-offs is always an important thing to do. It's applicable to many other places in Magic when it comes to other sorts of philosophies and answering those questions, how you feel about them and what you're willing to do. Really important. Really cool stuff.
All right, well, let's get into our main topic. Let's talk about Pioneer, and I think we should start with, like we had just said, Cain, you won the Mana Trader series. Congratulations again on that. And you won playing Is It Phoenix, which going into the weekend, that would not have been the deck I guessed you would have played from everything I had seen leading up into that point. I guess I kind of checked out the last couple of days before the tournament, to be fair, but you won with that deck. And so we really kind of want to talk about that experience, how you got there, and then we're going to take a minute to talk about the format wider. But how did we get to Is It Phoenix for this tournament? Because, correct me if I'm wrong, you were really high on the Jeskai Ascendancy deck, or the 4-color Ascendancy deck, going into that weekend.
The two decks really are very similar in a lot of ways when you look at the cards that they contain, which I think kind of informs a lot of how I approach the format. They both leverage delve spells and expressive iteration. Despite both doing that, they're kind of soft to different elements of the format. And while I had been playing a ton of Ascendancy combo, the format had shifted more aggressive in response to that. So Ascendancy's position was like looking a little shakier than I was comfortable with. And Phoenix, you show up with 8 spot removal spells, you show up with Thing in the Ice, and your opponent has a Llanowar Elves on the other side of the table, and you just start rubbing your hands together.
A juicy appetite. If you don't mind me asking, what were some of the things about the Ascendancy deck that had you kind of going lower on it? Because one of the last things we mentioned on the show here is I talked about how I had watched you and Bob and Cheese play some of the Ascendancy deck. I talked to you for a little bit about the Ascendancy deck before I played a little in Pioneer. You can take Ascendancy from my cold dead hands, I believe was my last quote on the format. So what was some of the stuff that sprouted up that made you want to move away from that sort of delve expressive deck to the other one?
Like I think I briefly mentioned it, was the format started getting a lot more aggressive. You saw like the red decks adopting a bunch of Eidolons, the red-white heroic deck pop up a lot, which is very fast and hard for Ascendancy to deal with. Traditionally, a poor matchup for Ascendancy.
Is the Mono Green Devotion deck a big problem for the Ascendancy deck? I've seen that deck popping up recently, but it seemed more post this event.
As far as Llanowar Elves decks go, I would much rather play against Mono Green with Ascendancy than I would Winota. I think that's less a factor. Mogged and Ori Baumeister might disagree, but I kind of think the Mono Green deck is a little slow compared to some of the more aggressive elements, so I don't really believe Mogged when Mogged says that the green deck crushes Ascendancy.
I can't really speak to the Ascendancy matchup, but one of the decks I did play in preparing for this episode and kind of, making sure I still understood what was going on in Pioneer, because it had been a while since I played, was the Mono Green deck, after seeing some talk about it. And it did not seem like a deck that was really drag racing like other decks so much. Like I had a huge problem with the Winota matchup. I had a huge problem with basically all of the combo decks I faced, but the aggressive decks it was very good against. So I could see it like probably being close and having draws, but you're talking about how the swaths of the format, the one that you really like to play in and the one that you think is the best right now, are these expressive iteration, consider Treasure Cruise decks. And I think that among those, Phoenix does a little better against decks that are trying to play to the battlefield, especially with Llanowar Elves, because of the fact that it's so much easier to interact with the stuff that matters, which is mostly their mana in the early game, right? Because of the new Magma Spray and Wild Slash or whatever shock you're playing.
Yeah, and it goes deeper than just that you play more spot removal spells, because like with Ascendancy, you can play a bunch of Change the Rocks, Portable Holes, and such, but the nature of your mana base means that you're never casting those spells on turn 1. You just play the game a little slower fundamentally than Phoenix will, which I think is also really important when it comes to interacting with the aggro decks and the Llanowar Elves decks, especially on the draw.
Casting a Chain of the Rocks on the draw is a much bigger ask than casting a Wild Slash on the draw for a 4-color deck versus a 2-color deck. That's for sure.
Thank you for kind of delving into that. When it came to kind of settling on your configuration for the deck, we'll have that in the description. I'm sure people could have found that already. And, we've got a new set coming out, so be with it what it will. But how do you kind of start your process on figuring out the kind of the whole 75 you want to play once you had kind of settled in on like, okay, not super in love with how the Ascendancy deck is lining up versus these things. I think I want to play Phoenix. How do you sort of settle in and what's your process on that part of it?
For Phoenix, it was a deck that I had a lot of prior experience with, and there are like a couple different camps when it comes to how to build Phoenix. Like there are people that don't really build it with pieces of the puzzle, Crackling Drake, and will play 4 treasure cruises. And then there's the camp that plays 4 pieces of the puzzle, has Temporal Trespass, X2 usually. And I know that the latter is how I prefer to build the deck, and something that Known Crusher Gold Ducat plays week in and week out. So I just went and pulled up the latest Gold Ducat list, made the changes that I thought were appropriate, which was like leaning slightly heavier into the trespass side of things. So like adding another galvanic iteration, changing the sideboard a little bit, and then just making sure that all my in and outs work, which I think is always the most important part that people sometimes forget when they just make changes to decks. It's just making sure that all your mapping works.
Yeah, when you mean mapping, you're talking about like what you're going to sideboard in for the cards you are bringing in. So like you change the Gul Dukat list and you change some of the sideboard cards, and now suddenly you have 8 cards for the mono green matchup, but you only have 3 cards you want to cut, and then you suddenly have like all this dead space. Is that what you're referring to?
Yeah, that's exactly it. Honestly, I think it's one of the most important parts in deck building. I think it's kind of had different names over the years. Like people used to call it like elephanting a deck or whatever, kind of building your decks with a more cohesive vision of an entire 75 or a 95, as opposed to, all right, I built my 60, time to build my 15 next. You really need everything to mesh together nicely. And if you're starting with a list and you make changes, you just need to make sure that you bring along a sense of cohesion still.
No, it totally makes sense. Side note, it always blew my mind that they called it elephant deck building instead of buffaloing, because you use every piece of the buffalo is like a phrase, at least here in the South, that people use a bunch, right? Like every piece of the buffalo, and then like elephant, because the elephant knows it all, remembers everything, and it's like, I don't know, whatever. I remember that every time we talked about elephanting. Anyways, you mentioned with the 2 decks, the more Temporal Trespass, that version versus the one that leans less on it. What are the kind of strengths of the 2 decks in particular? Like you said, you prefer the strengths of the Temporal one. What do you like about that, and what are the merits of the other deck, and like what would maybe be the reasons to play less of the Time Walks in Phoenix?
The biggest reason to play fewer Time Walks would be if you don't expect any aggro or any combo, really. Can't tell already, I'm very low on the other approach to Phoenix. Not like trying to throw shade or anything, but I think that Trespass really kind of revitalized the deck for me in what it's capable of doing. One of the problems that I traditionally had with Pioneer Phoenix versus, say, like experience playing Phoenix in Modern all those years ago at this point.
Rest in peace.
Yeah. Was, in Modern you had free spells. So you had like Metamorphose. So you play Thing in the Ice on turn 2, and against an aggressive deck, you were flipping that on turn 3 quite frequently. With Pioneer, when you play Thing in the Ice, you're never flipping it the next turn, basically, unless you're playing one super late. And specifically on turn 5, against a lot of the aggressive decks, you've kind of played 1 or 2 removal spells, and maybe played like pieces of the puzzle or whatever. Your graveyard is somewhat stocked. You're able to go Thing in the Ice, Temporal Trespass, take a counter off, and refresh your mana. and then you flip Thing in the Ice, just kind of in one go. It's almost like Wilderness Reclamation in a way, just like refresh your mana is really important to stabilizing versus a lot of decks, but more specifically turning the corner, I should say, which is a very important concept for playing this deck as it's constructed. Is it's very much kind of like a combo control deck. Like I just described one way that you use Temporal Trespass, but obviously there's also the Galvanic iterations on 5 mana, or later on, Galvanic Trespass, take 2 extra turns, either return some Phoenixes or don't. That's a way to easily steal decks from matchups that might be bad or board positions that don't look good. I think that's why you have Hauled Storm Giants as opposed to, say, Historic Phoenix, where it's much more aggressively slanted.
Gotcha. So it's much more about when to take this bigger position that is able to go a little longer, and then you have a card in Temporal Trespass, which I've never messed up before in my life. And with that, you're able to kind of steal some games, but also kind of have an unfair way to reset games if they were starting to slip through your grasp, in the same way like that you mentioned a Wilderness Reclamation might do it, where like a Cryptic Commando, like tap draw, for example, might do it in the old Modern.
Like pretty much the gain a lot of extra mana away.
Well, that's interesting. You won with the deck. Do you have any thoughts, big picture-wise, about the Phoenix deck before we start talking about other decks and Pioneer as a bigger format? Do you have anything you think that the listeners should share, or maybe a hill you want to die on about Phoenix, and this is your platform to speak about it? We're here to listen.
Already mentioned my hill that you should 100% play the Pieces version over other versions. And the biggest piece of advice would be, like I said, just to think of it like a combo control deck. Very often you're not attacking with your Phoenixes. You need to kind of train yourself when to smell the blood in the water and just dial the aggression up from out of nowhere.
Yeah, that was always, I don't know how y'all felt about it, but with the Modern Phoenix deck, it was really weird about like how sometimes you're like, all right, I brought back my 2 Phoenixes and it's past the turn time because I got to block a Mana Strider. It's just a weird kind of thing that you don't always think about with how when are your Arclights being used as more removal spells versus your way to close the game out in matchups where it isn't as, clear cut.
It is kind of funny though, because I would have mentioned Modern Phoenixes like a more aggressively slanted one, kind of similar to Historic. I actually think back to playing Phoenix in Standard. It was very much always just leaving Phoenixes back all the time.
It's a very interesting and wild card that it's really cool how it does all these different roles and all these different formats.
I think it's that parallel you're drawing of it being much more like playing the Standard deck from when Arclight Phoenix was in Standard than like the Modern deck. And I think it also speaks to why you tend to lean towards Temporal Trespass, because what made the Modern version so strong was being able to quickly assemble a couple of Phoenixes and have multiple combats where that was the best thing going on in play. But in Pioneer, since there's less of that, Temporal Trespass in the games we're able to like set up a copy or 2 of that, or like flip your Thing in the Ice to it, get a clean attack in for like 7 to 10 damage while the board's clear, and then have another turn coming. Like that just changes things to feel more like that Modern deck when you've resolved that spell in those positions than kind of the Standard more, well, I guess I'll just keep on grinding you out and eventually I'll find this window to... In Standard, it was like, sneak through one of my Drakes or run you out of important resources and then start killing with these Phoenixes.
Big Daddy Nib Mizzet.
Yeah, exactly.
What are you gonna do now?
Treasure Cruise, drawing 3 cards is great, but so many of the decks in Pioneer can kind of like go bigger than what your 3 cards can answer at a certain point. And so being able to actually shut the door is more of an issue than being able to like keep playing the game for longer and continue doing this one play. You need to find a way to pivot. And I think that's a really important distinction that makes kind of the Pioneer deck bridging the gap between the 2 formats almost, is that, you're playing like the Standard deck most of the time, but when you have Temporal Trespass, you can kind of switch gears into being like, well, now I'm the deck that just deals you 18 damage over 2 combats. Also, those 2 combats, you're not going to be able to do anything between.
We'll probably talk about Phoenix, in regard to the other decks here in a minute, but let's kind of take a step back and talk about Pioneer from a bigger picture sense. But I think it's probably important when we talk about all these other decks and everything to start off with Cain. And from your point of view, what do you think the 2 or 3 best decks in Pioneer are? The
revolving door of Phoenix and Ascendancy that I kind of would regard as one slot almost, because the 2 are kind of rarely going to both be tier 1 necessarily. The red-black Luris Blood mid-range deck that has popped up recently is really strong. If I had to pick a third, it would probably be Heroic. I think it's the most powerful aggro deck, even if it's underexplored a little bit still, and does a really good job of policing the other aggressive decks with Reckless Rage. And I don't know, Lures is just a really messed up card.
That's fair. If the red-white heroic deck plays a Crone Crusader, I'm in. But until then, I'm out unless it's the best deck.
Really, you're not a fan of favorite Hoplite, Mason?
I played a lot of casual Magic at the start of this. You know, that time is like when I'm starting to play Magic. And Crone Crusader is cool. He makes little homies that are more like him, you know, and they all get into battle. There's a bunch of 1/1s going into the cause, dying to pack rats. But favorite Hoplite was lame and beat me all the time.
He just carried an ordeal way too well. Probably.
Yeah, little baby Mason just could not figure out how to beat these, you know, hyper efficient mana protection decks, and so we don't like favorite Hoplite. That's interesting. Okay, so I'm curious the red black deck because I don't play a whole bunch of Pioneer. I've watched you play it some in some Discord. You know, I catch streams and stuff like that, and I read content when it does pop up about Pioneer. But it seemed a little mopey to me, so I'm curious what has you so excited and high on this red-black midrange deck?
Right now, like I said, for a lot of the reasons I like Phoenix, this deck also does a very good job of kind of policing some of the more aggressive elements of the format. Obviously, Fatal Push, you can play the red shocks as well. You also have smooth mana just like Phoenix. And where Phoenix has expressive iteration and treasure cruise or whatever, this deck also just packs a ton of hyper efficient card advantage in its own right. Deadly Dispute is a really messed up card. It's a card I'm a very big fan of course. As much as I dislike this card in Modern, Kroxa is very, very good in this format, and particularly in this deck. And you just tie that all together with Loris. The deck has a lot of compelling elements to me.
All right, you got me a little sold on it. I might play a league with it. I've got it pulled up here on Goldfish while you were talking about it, so I'd be ready.
It's remarkably similar to the historic deck, I think before the Modern Horizons 1 cards, and maybe before Strixhaven really messed with that format. That was one of the more popular decks there with, like, you used to have Dreadhorde Arcanist and Thoughtseizes and discard spells in general, and the cheap removal. Yeah. That shell is just really powerful. Since looking at it then, it's gotten some pretty substantial upgrades with just its individual card quality being better. Where, you know, my biggest issue with decks like this, and when I've talked about Pioneer in the past, has a struggle of actually closing a game. Like, it'll play all these discard spells or just these disruptive elements that trade really efficiently, but then because of the restriction to have Luris, which it kind of needs, unless it has Kroxa, it doesn't really do much to end the game because most of its cards were like young pyromancers to enable village rights and Dreadhorde Arcanists. But I think that this Blood Vampire package not only lets it see more cards towards the Kroxa, but things like Bloodthirsty Adversary, just Blood Tithe Harvester being 3 power creatures that are as cheap as they are, that really impact the game. I think that's like a very big improvement. So this deck does look a lot better than I envisioned the deck when I think about it previously, now that I'm looking at these Blood builds.
Yeah, because you mentioned that historic deck, and functionally identical deck was also a Pioneer staple at one point with Dreadhorde Arcanist and Young Pyromancer, and I kind of initially dismissed these new builds because of similarities to the previous Mopey red-black deck, but I agree with a lot of what you just said regarding the increased card quality and threat quality. Another reason that I kind of enjoy this deck is it looks like it might be getting some new upgrades.
Ooh, that's exciting. Well, we are going to talk about some Kamagawa cards once we go over the current Pioneer, so I'm excited to see what card you have for there. I'm just going to say, if it cuts Archfiend Vessel from the deck, which every copy I've looked at this deck plays 1 Archfiend Vessel, I'm off whatever card you're pitching. We have 1 Archfiend Vessel. That's a staple of the deck. It's a lifelinker to beat the red-white aggro deck. Then bam, it comes back as a 5/5, close the game out.
The Vessel got me.
I opened the first deck list and I was like, oh, that's cute, a 1 of. And I like kept opening them and I was like, am I looking at different decks? And I was like, okay, yeah, they've all got 1 Archfiend Vessel. That's the optimal number.
That's kind of a thing with modern deck building with regards to like Pioneer specifically, is because while this is changing, it was a smaller format for quite a while after the whole inverter combo plus COVID dampened the hype a lot. A lot of like copy pasting decks rather than kind of working on them necessarily. So you get these odd quirks that just last over time, like Archfiend's Vessel.
I just love that no person was brave enough to cut the Archfiend Vessel. They all probably thought something like, is that really good? And they all like 5-0'd a league, and they're like, well, I forgot the one. And they're like, some of these people are even cutting down on claim fames. Like, I'm looking at this one has 2 claim fames. Barely bring it back. You have that in Luris, I guess. How that is.
I ever told you the Soulfire Grandmaster story, Mason?
No, we can take a second though if it's on this topic.
My friend and one of my like earliest Magic mentors, Danny Goldstein, he lost the finals of an Open with a white-red tokens deck in like Khan's Fate Reforged standard to Gerard Fabiano, where the morning of the event, he was looking for as many copies of Soulfire Grandmaster as he could find, and he wound up only finding one because he wasn't paying $30 for this Mythic Rare on the day of weekend release tournament. And he would have had 2, but I wasn't going to let him borrow my pre-release foil copy that was worth a bunch of money, and I knew he'd riffle shuffle. Fast forward like a month and a half, people still just played one Soulfire Grandmaster in this deck and this archetype until Ben Stark was like, I feel like these Secret Ways are good. Soulfire Grandmaster is also good. I should just be playing 4 of both. And it completely changed the archetype, made it go from like this tier 2 deck kind of struggling to find its way to like one of the best decks in the format. So don't be afraid to cut these 1-ofs, people. If you're out there looking at a deck list and you're like, either a card is underperforming for you or overperforming for you, don't be afraid to mess with numbers. Just make sure the reason you're doing it makes sense, because sometimes the reason people do things doesn't make sense. I just always think of that whenever I see these random 1-ofs, and it takes time for people to like either cut them or adopt them more.
That red-white deck was nice. Buyback Stoke the Flames.
That was a good time. I do like buying back Stoke the Flames. So I would like to kind of do is, because, Pioneer's changed a lot. And we maybe should mention this at the start, but, when Pioneer first came out and I was first in love with it, and Inverter, rest in peace, taken too soon. Ban did give me Inverter back. The format was combo. There was that mono black aggro deck, and then everyone else was doing good stuff. We were mono whiting, we were inverting, we were breaching. But now the format, it's fair to say, is a lot more aggressive and some combo-ness. What do you think about the whole state of Pioneer?
I think Pioneer, it's pretty robust right now. I've mentioned a lot of aggressive decks, but that's less a constant of the metagame and more kind of a recent rotation sort of thing. Ascendancy, the deck that I just moved off of, is 100% a combo deck, was revitalized by cutting the mid-range element of Omnath. You would be remiss to leave out Lotus Field entirely, which is a very interesting deck because it's technically a combo deck, but as a very smart Tristan has said, it's very much more like Tron in this format. It just looms overhead for anybody playing too slow.
Our friend Connor Mullally, he was offering Lotus Field coaching, and he had a little guide, and he posted it to some of his friends and was like, hey, if anyone wants to take a look at this to like give me revisions or whatever, I'd love their opinion. And I read it, and I read the line of Lotus Field is essentially Tron in there. It's something that if you had asked me to compare it to a modern deck, I maybe would one day get to, but as soon as I read it, I was like, oh, that's so true. It does all the same things. You mulligan the same or a very similar way. Totally changed my perspective on the deck. So I do love that you brought up that point about Hidden Strings. I was going to kind of ping around and bring up some decks. Can we start with Hidden Strings and kind of get your opinion on this deck before we jump around to some other decks that maybe people have heard of or thought of and they can kind of get your 2 cents on? What do you think about the Hidden Strings deck in current Pioneer?
So I think it's extremely good at what it does, which is beat up the slow decks. You're never going to lose to control, really. You're going to farm Gemmed Sack all day, mid-range decks like Vampires, because so much of it is devoted to like the whole mana engine. It does really struggle against the aggressive decks. So it's kind of just a deck to keep in your back pocket, I think. But when it is good, it is very good.
Lotus Field's definitely a deck I've thought about. They did the Pioneer Precons, and I thought about picking that one up because you're very close if you own the Shocklands, basically, to owning like the full deck. Yeah, I might just Goldfish this deck a bunch, and when I need to play a Pioneer tournament and the weekend's right, I'll be ready. So that's interesting to hear. I'd love to talk about Gemmed Sack because it's funny. 6 months ago, if someone had told me or asked me, hey, what's Cain playing in Pioneer? I'd be like, I don't know, ask Cain, but I'm going to guess Gemmed Sack. Every time I turn the stream on, that's what Cain's doing. So what do you think about Gemmed Sack right now and that sort of deck in general in the format? Because you were doing really well with it and like pushing the archetype in a lot of ways 4 or 5 months ago. So what do you think about the deck right now?
Right now, I think it is not great. So Gemmed is very good into most of the aggro decks, but it struggles really heavily against the Delve decks. I think the matchups are kind of irreparably bad. I tried so many different things. At one point, I was even splashing white for Rites of Oblivion and Sideboard Deafening Silences. Nothing really worked to make the deck good against Phoenix or Ascendancy.
What about the Delve spell decks like Ascendancy or Phoenix really are oppressive to the sack strategy? Because, as much as that deck does seem like it's still reliant on some of its smaller stuff, is it just like the removal is too good against you? Is it you don't have the time to set up an overwhelming board state?
Well, the problem is you give them too much time. Jund is very good when its engine creates like relevant pieces of cardboard. And if you're just sitting there twiddling your thumbs with a cat in an oven, the Phoenix player or the Ascendancy player just gets to cast cantrips all day. The Delve spells are just going to go way over you. And the problem is, like, if you try to go fast with like the Citadel builds or whatever, now you're playing Llanowar Elves, and now you're soft to all the spot removal that the food version blank. So it's very much, it exists in like this zone where it's just fundamentally smaller.
You're bigger than the aggressive decks, but you're not bigger than these Delve decks, which are also bigger than the aggressive decks. There's not really room.
And then on the same token, or the other side of the coin, you're too slow and not aggressive enough to really punish them. People usually like try to like go blank X4 out the side or whatever, but that doesn't really work when you're not backing it up with pressure like the red-black mid-range decks might be.
All right, well, speaking of pressure, what about Nio and Noda? Because that's a deck that I've heard a lot of people kind of talk about, and a deck that I think a lot of people kind of assume is one of the best things going on in Pioneer.
The highs are high and the lows are low. You know what you're signing up for when you put Winota in your deck. It obviously creates some absolutely absurd board states, and if you're not interacting with Llanowar Elves, you're probably going to lose to this deck. But on the same token, when people do interact with your Llanowar Elves and you're playing a Winota on turn 4 with no board state, your deck's looking a lot less impressive. The introduction of Huntmaster to the deck, the Werewolf Grave Titan hybrid thing, has done a lot for the deck in terms of just making your non-Winota draws more consistent and threatening. But I think it's overall a little more inconsistent than I would want a deck to be, even if it does meet the metrics for powerful.
This is a deck that when it first started popping up in Pioneer, it was kind of just a pile of Llanowar Elves, Goblin Realm Masters, Legion War Bosses, Eldritch Evolutions, and Winota, and your plan was just stick a Winota and then hope you flip Angrath's Marauders off of your multiple attackers and just kill the opponent immediately. But looking at the deck now, it's changed a lot. It has, like you said, this Tovolar's Huntmasters are kind of your top end now, which are still very powerful creatures to be cheating into play off the back of Winota, but you also have Sasika's Chariot as kind of like a way to back up this more mid-rangey creature plan up until it casts a Winota, or give it a better way to cleanly establish a Winota and attack for a trigger against a lot of decks. Brutal Cathar is another really strong human the deck has picked up. And Prosperous Innkeeper, I think, is also one of the more important cards, because that's another mana creature that not only doesn't tap for green, so you can actually like cast your 3 colors of spells by using this treasure, but is also not a human. If they kill your Llanowar Elf or Elvish Mystic on turn 1, but you cast this on turn 2 and a Winota, you can like pretty much guarantee a trigger unless they have to trade down into Prosperous Innkeeper.
The little halfling that could.
Yeah,
and
this is actually like one of the decks I'm most interested in when it comes to the format right now, because it seems like just having the hybridization of those plans is more of a creature deck with an unfair aspect than kind of this unfair deck that uses creatures. Over time, as this gets more work put into it, I think this deck really has potential to be one of the strongest decks in the format, because that kind of mixture of elements is always very potent.
I think that this is one of the strongest decks. I just think that the consistency elements kind of are a little bit lacking compared to the other decks I would also consider strong. And I think that kind of goes for any deck that is leaning so hard on elves in a 3-color mana base for now.
I have 2 decks that I would like to talk about before we move on to Kamagawa. Abe, feel free to throw in anything after this if you have a question where you want to talk. I feel like everyone, before the COVID times, they loved Niv Mizzet. It was always Niv Delight. You always saw people play Niv. It never really did well. but it was always there. Has Niv gotten enough? We've had 2 years of new sets. Is it good?
I don't really like Niv. There was a while in between period after they banned Uro and Reclamation and Teferi and all those cards where it seemed like it might be the best thing to be doing. But this deck really struggles with Mystical Dispute. There are a lot of natural predators that can prop up, like Spirits is a deck that can wait in the wings, or some of the other aggressive decks, but mostly Phoenix being able to play 4 Mystical Disputes plus Ether Gust, Ascendancy being able to play 4 Mystical Disputes plus Ether Gust, give Niv a really hard time. Plus, we talked about 3-color mana sub-ideal and 4-color mana being a weakness of Ascendancy, and now we have the 5-color deck where you're just not going to be playing on curve ever.
I mean, it's just one more color. How much could it really hurt?
We just need more triumphs.
Yeah.
New Caperna's a wedge set, or whatever the Bant one's called. Charge.
I expect to get more triumphs, given that the door's already been opened. I kind of wish the door had never been opened, but...
Well, we got to talk about Kamagawa first, which we'll do after I ask my last question about a deck, which is these Vampires decks. Now, I was a huge fan of the mono-black aggressive decks, the Thoughtseize, 1-drops, Scrap Heap Scrounger, a long time ago in Pioneer, before the Inverter bans, and I guess even before Inverter really popped up, that was like my go-to default. I don't really know what to play, but it can't be that bad. It just kind of has a strong curve and a strong game plan, but I see now that's kind of become more of this vampire-based deck with Sorin, Imperious Bloodlord, the 3-mana Sorin. Is that kind of just a reaction to the aggressive decks? Is this like deck well-positioned, do you think?
Vampires has always done one thing really well in this format, and that is just curb stomp the aggressive decks. Unfortunately, I think even with the White Splash, it does pretty poorly into Phoenix and Ascendancy, which is a common trend with a lot of these other decks that beat up on aggro decks.
Yeah, this list I'm looking at from the challenge over the weekend that won the challenge has 4 Deafening Silence and 4 Go Blank in the sideboard. So I can't imagine if you're devoting 8 cards to those kinds of matchups that it's a good matchup at all.
Like, initially they kind of got away with it when the most recent Vampire set had just come out, but then Phoenix players are like, oh yeah, Stern Dismissal exists. You can just set up a timely Thing in the Eyes, you Stern Dismissal, and then you Thing in the Eyes plus Time Walk. This was a deck that I used to also really like once upon a time, but I think it really needed to get an upgrade from the vampire themed sets and just didn't. For now, this is kind of a deck where I'm always going to keep my eye on it because 3-mana Sorin Planeswalker is absurdly powerful as a tribal payoff. This card is like totally berserk as far as Planeswalkers go. It's 3 mana.
Yeah, Sorin plus Champion of Dusk was the only deck that competed with the kind of stranglehold that Scapeshift and Field of Ruin had on the standard format. They were both legal together, so the pedigree is definitely there for the card and for the tribe.
It's really just that filling out the rest of the deck, you kind of don't have a good time. You're showing up with Gifted Aetherborns, Dusk Legion Zealot. Magic has kind of left Elvish Visionary behind, and we're registering 4. It's like 75% of a deck, and it needs the rest to be printed to be a serious contender, I think.
Kalitas isn't good enough for you? You're too good for Kalitas?
It's 4 mana and does nothing on its own. Kind of hard to justify playing cards like that these days, especially when it comes to Vampire. You're foregoing Loris for all this as well, compared to the other mid-range decks. In Companion era Magic, you need to be really sure about what you're doing if you're not playing a Companion.
That was fun. Hopefully that was helpful for a lot of listeners, kind of catching them up on Pioneer, getting some thoughts on the format if you're competing a bunch. Hopefully that was helpful for you as well. Get some of Kane's insights. All crushing Pioneer every week. We do kind of want to talk about some of the Kamagawa Neon Dynasty cards, because Pioneer, like we kind of talked about, is the one format that's eternal, where we don't have the MH2 and the MH1 pressure leaning on the format. And I know there are a couple of cards that you want to talk about. You hinted with one of them in red-black. So, Kane, I'm curious, what are some of the cards you're excited for Kamagawa? And I've got a couple written down here if you don't mention them, so I'm ready to throw them at you.
All right. Well, the biggest one is not actually for red-black at all. And I'm going to start with this one because I think it has the most relevance for the format, and that is Lightpaw's Emperor's Voice, the Aura Tutor dork.
Light Paw's Emperor's Voice is 1 white for a legendary creature, Fox Advisor 2/2. When an aura enters the battlefield under your control, if you cast it, you may search your library for an aura card with mana value less than or equal to the aura with a different name than each aura you control. Put that card on the battlefield attached to Light Paw Emperor's Voice, then shuffle. So what's got you excited for this card? Do you want to SRAM?
Yeah,
Some Madcap
in the
experiments?
SRAM style decks, exclusively in the SRAM style decks, really. It's just kind of a consistency piece. One thing I will say about this card is it's much better for auras in paper than it is on Magic Online, because one of the auras that you really want to pair this with is Kaya's Ghost Form, which does not work properly on Magic Online right now.
Wait, what? It just doesn't work?
Yes, it just does nothing.
I always wondered why no one played black in their aura stack. Okay.
So that's why you've seen like blue-white kind of emerge recently with the discovery of Melitist Astronomer. So Tristan, who I mentioned earlier, is Tristan_MTG_ on Twitter. And it's actually still his pinned tweet where he won a PTQ with 2 Kaya's Ghost Forms that did not trigger for the entire PTQ. That was almost a year ago.
Maybe they'll fix it for this one. Maybe enough people start playing it.
I sure hope so, because
they'll get their 3 people right on it.
Being able to tutor up an enchantment basically right away if you play this on 3, that also gives us resiliency, is much better than just getting your Griff Spoon or your Ethereal Armor that you haven't found yet. But in general, I think this card just adds a lot of power to the board quickly and is a better threat than the deck currently has available.
Yeah, it's kind of like another core Spirit Dancer type effect in that way, where like Spirit Dancer kind of, it's the second best thing in the historic decks, but in Pioneer you don't have that. But this, it finds you more of your Ethereal Armors off your All the Glitters and finds you, more of your, whatever the specific kind of bullet aura, or in the case of playing these black build, Kai's Ghost Form or Demonic Vigor to immediately protect something.
It can find auras with the same mana cost as well, so when you play your Ethereal Armor, you can just grab the thing right away. It's not just when you play your 2 mana auras.
I misread that. I thought it was only less than, but you can really get double the value.
I feel like if I was a Pioneer player, when we eventually have a Pioneer tournament in person, if Kaya's Ghost Form's still not like fixed, I'm either going to be playing like Ascendancy if that's still somehow legal, or this with Ghost Form. And all my opponents are going to be like, what do I do? I wasn't prepared for this.
I've never played against this.
Yeah. The Moto metagame, were they all net decking or just not prepared for my cards that actually work in real life, which is truly astonishing. Okay, well, what are some other cards that have you hyped from Kamagawa?
So a lot of the other cards, one of them pairs into red-black potentially pretty smoothly, which is Reckoner Bankbuster, which I'll return to in a moment. The general theme with this set, we had the enchantment theme where I just dropped that one card, but other than that, it's kind of Kaladesh 2 in a lot of ways. There's a lot of really cool artifact stuff going on that kind of paves the way for a lot of avenues of exploration in Pioneer that weren't quite there. Okay. There's just a lot of small cards. Well, Reckoner Bankbuster is a big card. 4/4 vehicle and Maze Mind Tome.
That's kind of sick.
There's a lot of smaller enablers.
I like Lizard Blades.
Not where my brain was at.
But let's be honest, you're not a Lizard Blader. Now that I put it in your mind, where is it swimming?
No.
No doubt.
Honestly, there's one really innocuous card that's had my brain churning for a while since I saw it, is Experimental Synthesizer. It is a single red artifact that when it enters or leaves the battlefield, you exile the top card of your library. Until end of turn, you may play that card. So it impulse draws when it enters or leaves, and it also has 2 and a red, sacrifice the artifact, create a 2/2 white samurai creature token with vigilance only as a sorcery. It's an impulse draw on the way in and on the way out, and it's a creature plus the impulse draw on the way out. So it really seems like a lot of just raw potential for advantage, while also being, a cheap artifact to grease the wheels for, in Soul Artifact Shrapnel Blast decks exist in the past. This seems like a card that could fit in there when they play all these cheap spells and really just kind of want to find the right stuff and see enough cards in their deck because everything's so small ball. Which is a form of like really cheap greasing the wheels, naturally works, and also has a ton of other potential for synergy if you're sacrificing it to other effects. Like, this is a card I might consider playing in some extreme modern decks in fringe cases if the format were a little different, or put into my cubes. Like, it just has so many cool looking applications. It seems like a huge potential for a banger in the making.
Yeah, this is one of the other cards that I'm very excited to deck build around. If you want to talk other small artifacts, there's also Moonsnare Prototype, which is the pseudo Springleaf Drum, which can tap Experimental Synthesizer for mana, and both are 1-drops for Emery, which has not really made an appearance in Pioneer.
What about Dragon Spark Reactor? Any love there?
This is the kind of card where I could see it in the same deck with Synthesizer if you're trying to do some degenerate, paradoxical outcome kind of thing. Synthesizer, it leaves the battlefield, not goes to the graveyard, so you're just choosing your POs even more there, and then you just fire off a reactor at them. But overall, I don't know if this card really will have a home. The 2-mana artifact that I would be more excited for would be the Oni Colt Anvil.
For listeners at home, Dragon Spark Reactor is 1 in a red. When it or another artifact enters the battlefield under your control, you put a charge counter on Dragon Spark Reactor. Then for 4 mana, you can sacrifice the reactor to deal damage equals number of charge counters on it to target player, and that much damage to up to 1 target creature. So it's a good way to trigger a bunch by having a bunch of different artifacts come into play and then fling it at people.
What's Oni Colt? I can't even find it on the list.
It's a red-black artifact. Whenever 1 or more artifacts you control leave the battlefield during your turn, create a 1/1 colorless construct artifact creature token. Triggers only once each turn. Tap, sacrifice an artifact. It deals 1 damage to each opponent. You gain 1 life. You can draw a card with mana perfectly open with Synthesizer. It's red-black, so now you're open to potentially Mayhem Devil possibilities, especially since this will trigger off Cat Oven. There's a lot going on with this card that kind of pairs well with some of the other mentioned cards. This can sack blood tokens.
You can sack a Lizard Blade before they kill it. Any other cards that are jumping out to you?
I mentioned Bankbuster earlier, but we didn't really talk about it.
Oh yeah, what's the Bankbuster?
Maze Mind Tome meets creature.
Yeah, it's a 2-mana artifact vehicle with crew 3, and it is a 4/4, and it enters battle with 3 charge counters on it. You can pay 2 and tap it to remove a charge counter from the Bankbuster to draw a card. Then, if there are no charge counters on the Bankbuster, you create a treasure token and a 1/1 colorless pilot creature token that has the pilot text of this creature crews vehicles those power were 2 greater. It's a 4/4 vehicle for 2, but also you can use your mana to draw cards with it, and then on the last use, you get a little bit of mana back, and you get a way to crew it guaranteed, and start using your 4/4, as well as having drawn a few cards. But it's Maze Mod Tome, which all it really does is gain you 4 life at the end of you drawing 4 cards, or scrying, or whatever it is you do with that dumb old piece of junk, you know? But this one, you get a creature.
Thanks.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so what's got you hyped about this one? Like you said, it is like Maze Mind Tome creature, so what's going on that's like got you more hyped for this than Maze Mind Tome?
So, like I mentioned with Red-Black earlier, you know, you have a lot of 3-power creatures that aren't attacking through Thing in the Ice or whatever. This just attacks very well, while also letting you grind things out. It's non-legendary, unlike Heart of Kirin. It's a vehicle that does things when you have no creatures. It's just a very robust card. It just reads to me like a really good card. It's hard to articulate why I'm super excited for it, other than it goes in these good card decks.
That's
It's kind of a poor explanation, but...
You like a good rate monster every now and again, and you're here.
Yes.
All right, well, let's hype. That's some exciting things for Kamagawa. Our Kamagawa episode's going to be up in about 6 days from the time the listeners are hearing this, maybe 5 days. We're doing it a little later than normal, but it's going to be pretty interesting still. There's a lot of really exciting cards. We talked about some of them here just now. But first, we do need to wrap up this episode. Cain, thank you so much for coming on and talking all about the Pioneer format and answering our questions and going in depth on everything. It was great to have you on the show, bud.
Thank you for having me.
Of course.
It was a lot of fun.
Cain, feel free to plug yourself. Where can people find you? All of that jazz.
People can find me on Twitter / just my name, so Cain Rianhard. It should be in the episode title, so easy to spell. I stream on Twitch at twitch.tv/Sneaky Misato. I've been trying to kind of dial that up again recently.
All right, well, we're just going to have to get in the mech when it comes to Kamagawa, if you know what I mean. All right, okay, thank you so much for coming on. If you want to find me, you can find me on Twitter at Mason E. Clark. You can find me on Twitch at twitch.tv/TheMasonClark. And you find me each and every week on Card Kingdom. Abe, where can people find you?
You can find me over on twitter.com/morenothings. And you can find my blog where I host stories of players like you going out and playing Magic at Tree of Tales MTG. Twitter.com/Tree of Tales MTG. Looking always for people to write. It's really my two things these days.
Well, you'll see the next episode, everyone, a little early, so keep an eye out for that on your feed. We're going to record it early, so you're going to get it early. So, check it out a little sooner than maybe you normally would for the show. But until then, we'll see y'all next time for another episode of Constructed Criticism.
Goodbye forever.